Now, you haven't done any formal archaeological excavation for some time now. You haven't been out with your bucket and spade. Do you miss the business of excavation?
No, no. I did my last bucket and spade excavation in 1958. I don't know how many years ago that is, but I knew at the time it was going to be my last ever. And not only my last in India or Pakistan, but my last in my life. And so it was. And looking back, you know, I must forgive this, to my reasonable satisfaction, I think it was quite a successful goodbye. I'll tell you about it briefly. Let me take you first of all back to the beginning of the century, to 1902, when I was a small boy and you had even a dream. In that year, Lord Curzon was still the Viceroy of India. He decided in 1902 to revive the Archaeological Survey of India, which had a tentative existence on a number of occasions, but had never really come to fruition. And he sent word back to the India office in London, send me out a suitable archaeologist to take charge of this revived archaeological survey. Well, that inquiry, naturally went in those days straight to the British Museum. It was the only place to send it to. There were no archaeological departments in universities and so on to approach. And in the museum, the director of the period, his name doesn't matter, what they call trolled for a candidate. Let's say he sent around circular letters to all his departments saying, have you got anybody whom you can spare to go to India as Director General of Archaeology? And one of the departments, I have a pretty good idea of which, it's a long time ago, sent in the name of a man called Marshall. Now, the Marshall that they had in mind, and I can say this after this long interval with a proper, reasonable respect, the Marshall they had in mind was a junior member of the staff of one of the archaeological departments in the museum. He was competent and undistinguished, but they thought they could spare him. And so they sent his name up to the director. The director said, send Marshall to me. Shortly afterwards, the director was called away from his room for some purpose elsewhere in the museum, and there entered upon the scene a young man with an attractive, intelligent face called Marshall, John Marshall, who came from the British School at Athens. He was a Cambridge man originally, and who wanted to confer with the director of the British Museum with a view to his future career. Back came the director to his room, presented, this young Marshall was presented to him. The director naturally thought it was the Marshall he expected to see from his own staff. And he said, well, now look here, they want a man in India to look after the archaeological survey there. How soon can you go? Well, said the young Marshall, I want to get married. I said, how long will that take you? Well, he said, I could go in 6 weeks. Would that be all right? All right, I'll send back word to the Viceroy that you'll be in Delhi as soon as possible after, say, the next 6 weeks. So after the next 6 weeks, they arrived in Delhi, young John Marshall, of whom nobody ever heard. He was a student, accompanied by his young bride. I knew them both. And Curzon took to him once. He was an attractive young man, intelligent young man. Took to him. In fact, every Wednesday, I was told this by Marshall himself, every Wednesday the Viceroy would have Marshall in his office with him so that he could hear how a subcontinent should be conducted. What did Marshall do, you were going to ask me, weren't you? But when he got out there, I'll tell you. He did what any new Director General, what I did myself when I was a new Director General in India. He went round India to meet his staff and to see what India looked like. And he began, as I later on began, up in the northwest corner of what was then India, which is now India and Pakistan, which was the natural entry into India from the rest of Asia by land, surrounded by the mountains, which are generally hidden in mist. The most romantic part of the area, if you use the word romantic, which I don't. There he found a series of mounds, one of them a very high one, 60 or 70 feet high, still there, part of it, which represented the predecessor of the present Peshawar, the old capital of the frontier, which was known as Pushkalavati, in other words, Lotus City. And coming as he did from Greece, with the Acropolis very much in his mind, he thought, here's another Acropolis. I'll dig it up, we'll find perhaps another Parthenon on top of it. So, in 1903, he carried out the first excavations in modern times, but not by modern methods, I must say, because modern methods in 1903 were hard to come by, hadn't been invented. But he carried out excavations there, and to be quite frankly, made an awful mess of the job. It was to be expected, the young man with no training, and no training to match up to. Well, years later, it was 1944, which is, I suppose, about 42 years later, another English Director General began his tour in the same sort of way. He went up to the frontier, and he went out into the great open plain, which was covered with sugar cane, great waving masses of green sugar cane, waving like a sea, and rising out of these waves, rather like a battleship at anchor, was this great mound which represented the old capital city, Pushkalavati.
Sir Mortimer Wheeler had himself been appointed Director General of the Archaeological Survey for India in 1944. But he had to wait 14 years before he could excavate the ancient city of Pushkalavati. The chance came in 1958, when he was invited back to the frontier by the government of Pakistan.
I dug there. But before doing so, living as I was in 1958 and not in 1903, I had made arrangements beforehand with the Pakistan Air Force to have an air photograph taken of the area I was going to deal with, to see what that would show up. I didn't think at the time, I'll be perfectly frank about it, that much would happen. But what did happen was this. On the second day, my second day out there on the plain, standing by the tents, 3 or 4 of the tents which we had there for workshops and so on, when a jet fighter swooped down over my head, almost took my hat off. And it swung round and then almost poised like a dragonfly in the air. I discovered afterwards, on inquiry, that what was happening was that the poor pilot had been told, had been instructed at Peshawar to go away and photograph the old city near Charsada. When he got there, of course, there was no old city. He didn't realize these mounds were intended. And he didn't know what to do. And so he received instructions on the telephone to photograph the area for half a mile or so around my tents, which he did. He took about a quarter of an hour together, swooping about there, and I thought, my God, nothing will happen come out of this. After all, he's going too fast to begin with to get a decent photograph. But, next morning, a messenger came from Peshawar, from the Air Force there, with a bunch of photographs. And as I turned them over with my colleagues, I had two young men from Cambridge and other men from various parts of Pakistan. We looked through them, and they shrugged their shoulders. And I said, well, what do you make of it? They said, well, it all looks very nice, but rather muddled. I said, what do you make of that, when I held out one of them to him? But they looked again. They were not used to this sort of thing or this sort of quiz. So I said, well, this is the greatest discovery made in the frontier of Pakistan for perhaps 100 years. And then I explained what I saw on this air photograph was the plan of a large part of a Greek town, a Greek city. The lines of the streets were there, the lines of the house walls were there, right angles to the streets and parallel to the streets, and there in the midst was the circular shape of a Buddhist shrine. The whole thing was there. Nobody ever heard of it before. That afternoon went over to Sheikh Khan, which was the name of this mound. It was about 3 furlongs from where our tents were. And there it looked like a tumult, rather like a cross-channel sea on a rough day. But from the air, from 1,000 feet up, looking down as the camera had looked down, the whole thing fell into place. And what had happened was quite simple. The local farmers had found that there were the brick walls of an ancient city there. They dug lines along, the trenches along the lines of the walls and pulled out the bricks. And of course their trenches were no wider than the walls, otherwise they would have wasted their efforts. And so what they left for me and for the air photograph was a city in negative, with lines, hollow lines, where the walls had been. Well, thereafter, all this was verified 2 years later, 2 years after I'd left. It was verified by Professor Darnay, a local professor of archaeology at Peshawar University, who had been a pupil of mine. A very good fellow, very fine fellow indeed. You see, as one gets older, one boasts of one's pupils. No doubt that maybe in time to come, I shall be boasting of you, Meg. But never mind that for the moment. He dug there, he found the walls where I'd found the hollows in the ground, where the walls had been partially dug up. And he found these coins of Menander right at the bottom of the whole thing, many feet down, showing that this was in fact a Greco-Indian or Indo-Greek creation of approximately the middle of the 2nd century BC, in the Greek tradition, following the pattern set by Alexander the Great when he came there at the end of the 4th century. But the place was captured by the Chaucer, or rather Pushkalavati, was captured by Alexander's troops in the year 327 BC. And as a bonne bouche, I decided to find the defenses of the city at that time, because the fact that it took a trained division or corps of Alexander's troops 30 days to capture it implied that it was fortified. I wouldn't have told you that story if I hadn't actually found the defenses in question. It was up to me to find them, and I did.